but we're going to cover today what are often called the historical books. Now, of course, Genesis through Deuteronomy were historical books, but the bulk of that of the Torah is the law, the giving of the Mosaic law, God's law through Moses to the people of Israel, who He's created after His promise to Abraham, and who He's redeemed, delivered from slavery in Egypt, and brought out into the wilderness, brought them to Mount Sinai, gave them the law, and then promises to bring them into the promised land. Now remember, so much of this story is stemming from God's promise to Abram in Genesis chapter 12, where God said, "Go from your country, from your father's house, to a land that I will show you." At the time, Abram was living in Ur. And God says, "I will make you a great nation." He didn't have any kids at the time. "I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless all those who bless you. In him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So God promises a land. Go from your father's house to the land that I will show you. That's Canaan, the promised land. What's today very close to what is today the nation of Israel. Well, they wander, they go to Egypt, they receive the law, and then after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, they go into the promised land. And that's what the book of Joshua is all about. We'll look at this verse here in a moment. But to remind you, I talked about it last week, but I'll remind you again, the book of Joshua, you have Joshua, who's the leader of Israel after Moses dies. Joshua leads the people into Canaan. And the first 12 chapters of the book of Joshua are about the military conquest of the land. And sometimes it wasn't very much military. Sometimes they simply prayed and walked around the city, like in Jericho, and the walls fell down. God was clearly making it clear that He was delivering the people. So after they enter and they conquer several cities and drive many of the people out, in chapters 13 through 22, it's just a lot of details on different tribes and names and exactly the territory that they're going to live in, and which part of the promised land is their tribes, their families' specific inheritance. God's promises aren't just vague in general, but they have very specific results for these tribes. The 12 tribes of Israel, the sons of Jacob. And then the last 2 chapters, Joshua renews the covenant between Israel and God. He reminds them, just like Moses, before he died, reminded the people of God's covenant that He had made to Abraham, but also the God's covenant that He had made with Moses and through Moses to Israel, that they need to be faithful. God has promised to bless them greatly, and if they're faithful to God's promises and obeying God and worshiping Him alone and not going after idols, that things will go well for them, and they'll enjoy rest in the land and peace on all sides. But if they depart from God, then things will go badly for them. And Joshua says, so now you make a choice. Choose this day who you're going to serve. Choose this day whom you will serve. And the people say, oh, we will serve the Lord. And when you get down to chapter 24, verse 19, the people have just said, therefore, we also will serve the Lord, for He is our God. And so it's great, and it seems great. And the people seem like they're going to be faithful, and all's going to go well, and God's covenant's going to be fulfilled, and God will dwell as their God, and they will be His people. But then Joshua, right off the bat, says to the people in verse 19, you are not able to serve the Lord, for He is a holy God. He's a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. Joshua tells them, there's something wrong with your heart, and you're not able to serve the Lord. This is the fundamental problem with the law, with the Mosaic law, with God's covenant with Israel. This is the fundamental problem with Israel. This is the fundamental problem of the Old Testament, and that is that the people of Israel, God's people, are over and over and over again unable to obey God. They're unable to hold up their end of the agreement, their end of the covenant with God. And so that's what we're going to see especially today as we go further into the historical books and Judges and Samuel and Kings. So let's go now to the book of Judges. Judges is a great book. Be sure to read these chapters that have been assigned to you. In the book of Judges, the author is anonymous. We don't know who the author is. And here's the basic outline of the book. In the prologue, we see that Israel has failed to do what God told them to do. Remember last week we talked about how God told Joshua and the nation of Israel, go into the promised land, and it's filled with people who are sinning greatly. They're sacrificing their children to idols. They're going after other gods. There's all kinds of rebellion against the true God. And so you need to drive them out of the cities, drive them out of the land, so that you don't end up befriending them and intermarrying with them and going after their idols. And what happens when we get to the book of Judges, which is the timeline right after Joshua, is we find that the people of Israel have failed to fully obey what God told them to do. I'm pulling up Judges 127. So here we see Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth-shean. Verse 29, Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer, so the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, or the inhabitants of Nahalol, so the Canaanites lived among them, but became subject to forced labor. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh. So over and over and over again, we see Israel has not done what God called them to do. And now we come down to chapter 2, and God says to them, I brought you up from Egypt. I brought you into the land that I swore to your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars. So he's saying you should get rid of their false worship, but you have not obeyed my voice. What is this you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, and they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. As soon as the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the people of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. So God's saying, you fail right off the bat. You come into the land and you don't fully obey me. I'll never break my covenant with you, but you have already broken your covenant with me. In the book of Judges, here's how you can summarize, a good way to summarize the book of Judges is basically the book of Judges is a cycle of sin, the people sinning and rebelling against God, God allowing other nations, other peoples to come and oppress them and kind of ravage their land, take their livestock, oppress them, take their freedom. God allows that, and then the people cry out to God for deliverance, or at least they're just miserable, and God raises up a deliverer. God raises up what in the book of Judges is called a judge, and these are kind of military leaders, legal leaders, and these judges are mostly local leaders in parts of Israel, and they lead and gather people together to push off the oppressors and drive them out. And then what happens is they're delivered by God through the judge, and there's a period of peace. Then the judge dies, the people sin again, oppression, deliverance, and the whole cycle goes over again. And so I want to show you an example of this. There's multiple examples, and in your PowerPoint slide there you can see them. There's an example in chapter 2, 3, 4, 6, 10, and 13. So let's just look at the example in chapter 3 briefly. So in chapter 3, verse 7, it says, the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asheroth. And those are basically like fertility gods, other idols that they're going after. So they sin, and the children of Israel do evil in the sight of the Lord, right? So then the next step is their sin prompts the anger of God and results in oppression at the hands of some foreign nation. We see that here in verse 8. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, and the people of Israel served Cushan-Rishathaim 8 years. So they are being oppressed. Next step is during their oppression, the Israelites cry out to the Lord, verse 9. But when the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, next step, the Lord raised up a deliverer for the people of Israel who saved them. This first judge is named Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. So remember, Caleb was the one spy back in Numbers who said, no, we can go and take the promised land. All the others didn't think they could do it. Well, Othniel is his little brother, and he's a judge who helps deliver, through God's power, Israel from oppressors. The Spirit of the Lord was upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed over Cushan-Rishathaim. So the land had rest 40 years. Then Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. So this deliverance through a judge is often followed by submission of the enemy and a period of peace. Then the judge dies and is buried, and the people of Israel sin again in verse 12. And the cycle goes like this. And there's multiple judges as you work your way through the book of Judges. And often, but here's the deal: the judges usually aren't real great either. The people sin, and their leaders are also sinful. And as you go into the book, the deeper you get into the book of Judges, the darker the sin of the people gets. It gets to the point, like towards the end of the book, there's a situation where there is murder of a prostitute, and there's the story of her being chopped into pieces and sent out to the 12 tribes. And and you read that and you think, this is in the Bible? And what's going on? And what is going on is that the wickedness of God's own people, of Israel, is growing. It's like a cancer. Sin and idolatry is this cancer that's spreading, and God is displeased. And the breaking of the covenant by God's people is growing deeper and deeper. A couple of the most famous judges in the book of Judges would be Gideon and Samson. And Gideon is this guy who is doubtful and kind of afraid, and he's hiding out, and the angel of the Lord comes to him and says, Gideon, mighty man of valor, while Gideon's hiding out. And Gideon doesn't really want to do anything, and he tests God like 2 or 3 times after God's told him directly what he wants him to do, and he tears down one idol in his dad's backyard, but he does it in the middle of the night so nobody will see him. And God's kind of having to push him along, and then at the end of Gideon's life, he commits idolatry as well. Samson, his whole life, he is kind of guided not by any reverence for God, but by his own passions, by his own sexual passions, and by his own anger and desire for revenge. And you see these judges in Israel. God is delivering Israel, but even Israel's leaders are flawed and sinful, just like the people. So in the book of Judges, you think one of the main messages is that God's people are sinning, they're breaking the covenant, but also God is merciful. And even though his people continually fail him and continually turn away from him, God continually has mercy on them. And God's not like this God who kind of sits off in his recliner and when you've messed up and says, well, when you come around and come over and grovel for a while, then maybe I'll do some good stuff for you. No, that's not the picture of God at all. The picture of God is these people who are rebelling and sinning and doing whatever's right in their own eyes. And God doesn't just stay in his chair and wait for us to get it together. He leaves and he goes and he seeks them out, and he raises up for them a deliverer time after time after time. He's faithful to his promises. He's faithful to his people, and he's merciful. And that's what we see in the book of Judges. Like I said, it's like this. Think about going into a cave. The deeper you go into a cave, the darker it gets. And that's the way the book of Judges is. But when you come out of the book of Judges, you have the book of Ruth. And the book of Ruth is like this kind of bright ray of light in contrast to the book of Judges. And the book of Ruth takes place at the same time. So you see that right off the bat in the book of Ruth in chapter 1, verse 1, the same historical period. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. All right, so this is happening. Ruth comes right after Judges, and it's happening at the same time the people are doing whatever's right in their own eyes. They're not doing what God wants them to. They're sinning. Even their leaders are sinning in terrible ways. Like Samson is marrying women from idolatrous nations surrounding them and failing to faithfully worship God. And you come to the book of Ruth, and it's the same time period, and a man living in Bethlehem in Judah, which is in the southern part of the nation of Israel, he goes on a sojourn in the country of Moab. So because of the famine, he leaves and goes to Moab, which is another land nearby. And he takes his wife, who's Naomi, and his 2 sons. And Naomi goes with him, and they're Israelites, and the 2 sons, while they're in Moab, marry Moabite wives. And it's fascinating. A lot of times in the Old Testament, these events of Israelite men marrying foreign wives or Israelite women marrying foreign husbands results in increased idolatry. And in this story, these Israelite men marry Moabite wives, foreign wives, but this foreign wife, this Moabitess, is named Ruth, and she ends up being the hero of the story, a faithful woman who ends up loving God, showing, again, that God doesn't just love Israel, he loves all the nations of the earth. So let's work our way through this story and try to understand the main point of what is going on. They get there to Moab. The 2 sons marry 2 Moabite women. The husband dies, the 2 sons die, and Naomi is left there in Moab with these 2 daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. And so Ruth is a more common name today than Orpah, but I've actually known a couple people named Orpah. And they lived there about 10 years. And the daughter-in-laws Naomi hears that after everybody's died, hear that the famine's over back in Judah, and they can go back there, right? So Naomi says, I'm going to go back. My husband's died. My sons are dead. I'm going to go back. See you later, daughters-in-law. And Orpah says, okay, I'm going to stay here. But Ruth, in verse 14, clings to Naomi. And Naomi says, see, your sister-in-law, she's gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth says, this is one of the most beautiful verses in the Bible, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go I will go, and where you lodge I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. So again, we see this Gentile woman, a woman who's not from Israel, being blessed by Israel's God, by the true God. And so Naomi says, okay, you want to go with me, and go ahead. Chapter 1, verses 19 through 22, they arrive back in Bethlehem. And you may have heard of this town Bethlehem before, and we'll see why as we go on. So they get back to Bethlehem, and here's the situation. This is ancient world, agrarian culture, very different than our world. Like at Cal Baptist, I think it's 70% or 65% of the students are women. And women, basically every field of work is open to women, and in America, a woman's able to make plenty of money and take care of herself just perfectly. Well, in the ancient Near East, ancient Near Eastern cultures, and including Israel, you have this agrarian culture where wealth is connected to the land, and the land is passed down to the firstborn son. And so if you don't have land, it's hard to have a livelihood. And if you don't have a family to live with on that land, then you're in bad shape, right? And in God's law, when you read in Exodus and Deuteronomy, you see some provisions made for women, which were really revolutionary at the time. But you have Naomi, who hasn't had any land passed down to her. Her husband's died, and there are no sons to which the land can be passed down to. And so Naomi goes back into Bethlehem, but they're in a precarious spot. A widow's spot in most cultures throughout history has been a very precarious position. It's going to be hard to provide for herself. There's no one looking out for her, and she's not able to labor in order to take care of herself. So they get back, and Naomi has this relative whose name is Boaz. And Ruth says to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So Ruth's just saying, hey, let me go into the field and glean. And one of the things you may have seen when you read in the Pentateuch was that one of God's laws, this was in Leviticus 19, one of God's laws is that when you glean in the fields, you're not supposed to pick up, you're not going to get everything the first time. And things that just drop to the ground, you're not supposed to pick them up. You're supposed to leave them so that the poor can go behind and can be provided for by what's left over in the field. This was one of God's ways of providing for the poor. And so Ruth says, let me just go and I'll find someone who's okay with me following along behind them, and maybe God will provide for us that way. And she goes to the field belonging to Boaz, and behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to his reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz says to the young man who is in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you?" So Boaz provides protection for Ruth, and she finds favor in Boaz's eyes. And so really the book of Ruth is a love story. It's a story about this older man named Boaz and Ruth, a widow, and the way God in his providential care for them both brings them together, and the way Naomi, kind of a matchmaker, brings them together. And so Boaz is providing for them, and she gleans in the field, and she comes back and tells Naomi in verse 22. Naomi says to Ruth, "It's good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted." So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvests, and she lived with her mother. Now I want you to notice something in verse 20. Naomi says to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." And this is a concept that is, again, kind of foreign to us. But when Naomi's husband dies and her sons die before they have any children, so Naomi has no descendants. And so when Naomi dies, there will be nobody to take the land, right? And there's no descendant of her husband who has been given the land by God. And so God set up a system in which if a man dies before he and his wife have a child, then a close relative would have the opportunity, if they both wanted to marry, and then if they have a child, their first child would be seen as the heir of the woman's deceased husband, so Ruth's first husband. And that would take care of the land, and the heir, or their first son, would also be seen as the heir and would carry on the name of that man who had died before having any children. And so the lineage and the land would stay, well, the lineage would continue and the land would stay in the family rather than being gobbled up by kind of land barons or people who are trying to consolidate land. One of the things you see in the law is that God wants to, this inheritance that he's given to each tribe and to each family within the tribe, inheritance of land, is supposed to stay in that family in an ongoing way. And so even if one family gets in debt and kind of sells the land in order to get out of debt, at the end of 7 years, it was supposed to be kind of this year of Jubilee, and all of the debts are supposed to be paid back, and all the land is supposed to go back into the original owner's hands. So Naomi says, hey, Boaz is a potential redeemer. He's not maybe the closest in relative to your deceased husband, but he's a potential redeemer, and you found favor in his eyes. And so Naomi, you can tell, is kind of excited. And so in chapter 3, Naomi tells Ruth to go to Boaz at night and to kind of basically express to him, even though I'm younger than you, I'm open to you being my redeemer. And so she makes kind of this first move. And Boaz tells Ruth, this is great. Look at verse 10 of chapter 3. He said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, and that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer. Yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. So Boaz says, there's another guy that maybe, will get upset, and so I'll see what he thinks. But they end up getting married. And in chapter 4, you see the land is redeemed by Boaz. They get married, and they have a son. And the book of Ruth, you have this famine. It starts with famine. You have the death of Naomi's husband. You have the death of her sons. She has no other heirs, and she comes back and she says, call me Mara, which means bitterness, because my life is bitter and everything's gone bad for me and there's nothing good going on in my life. And then you see through this story God bring together Ruth, this foreign woman, who has committed to love and support Naomi, her mother-in-law, and to follow her God. See him bring together her, this faithful woman, and Boaz, this kind and faithful man who is out to protect Ruth and love her, and also to provide for Naomi. And God blesses through this story. He blesses Naomi, he blesses Ruth, he blesses Boaz. And you look at chapter 4, verse 13, it says, the Lord gave her conception, she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord. The women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So through this story, through these events, God blesses all of these individuals, but he's also blessing the nation of Israel. Through all of this sinful time we saw in Judges, God's at work. And the book of Ruth ends with a genealogy, which is very important all throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. And it says, these are the generations of Perez, who fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz, who's Ruth's husband. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. And this is very important because David, we learn in the next book of the Bible, is the king. He is the greatest king in Israel, and God promises to bless all the nations and all the earth through the line of David. So what we see here is that even in the darkest times in Israel, God was at work raising up a descendant who would bring blessing to Israel. He was providing a line of descendants that would result in a line of kings that would bring peace to oppressed Israel. So this is the line of David, and if you go over to Matthew chapter 1, the beginning of the New Testament, here's how it starts. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, father of Salmon, the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. So Jesus is the son of David, and David comes from the line of Ruth, a foreign Gentile woman who ends up loving God and following him, and God provides for him and for the nation of Israel and for all the nations through her line, eventually resulting in the birth of Jesus. So we leave Ruth and we go to the next book of this history, and the period of Judges moves into the period of the kings. And that's what 1 Samuel tells us about that transition. Samuel is the last here you go. I didn't show you that outline as I was going, but you have it. And it's not very detailed as I walk through Ruth. But Samuel is the last of the judges. And he ends up anointing the first two kings, Saul and David. Now, I want you to look with me at this outline. You have, basically the book breaks down like this. Samuel, and it tells, chapters 1 through 8 tell his story. His mom, Hannah, couldn't have a child, and she's brokenhearted over it, and she's crying out to God, and God answers her prayer and gives her a son. His name is Samuel. She dedicates Samuel to the Lord. He becomes this kind of great prophet, this great judge who leads in Israel. And then you come down to chapters 9 through 15 describes the kingship of Saul. Now, when you get to 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 4, it says, the elders of Israel gather together and come to Samuel at Ramah and say to him, behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. And so the people want a king. And what's interesting is they want a king like the other nations. They say these other nations, they have great kings, they're powerful, they're strong, and they can trust in their king. And we want a king like that we can look at. And in verse 6, the thing displeases Samuel. And he says, when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. And so God's saying, what was supposed to happen is I'm the king. And they're supposed to submit to me and my law and love me and worship me, and things will go well for them. I'll provide for them. I promised all these things. And they want a different king. They want to be like the other nations. And only warn them, verse 9, show them the ways that the king who will reign over them. And so Samuel goes to them and he says, okay, you're going to get a king, but he's going to take your crops, and he's going to tax you heavily, and he's going to take your sons and put them into war, and things will, and he'll take your daughters and make them perfumers and cooks and bakers and servants for him, and things won't go well for you. And they say, well, give us a king anyway. And so this dynasty that starts is God gives them what they want. And the first king of Israel, his name is Saul. Okay, Samuel's the last judge, and God sends Samuel, the last judge, to anoint Saul, the first king of the nation of Israel. Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin, and Saul is kind of your prototypical king kind of guy. He stands head and shoulders above all the other men. He's strong, he's powerful, he's huge. and he's anointed king, and he starts off pretty well. He defeats some Philistines, but he quickly goes and disobeys God, trusts in himself instead of in God, and rejects what God's told him to do, and then the Lord rejects Saul. And so what's interesting is that Saul doesn't, when God rejects him as king, Saul doesn't automatically stop being king. He's still in the office, he's still leading, he still has the palace and the throne, and he's in charge. But God says, you're not my king anymore. And what happens in 1 Samuel 16 is God sends Samuel, who's still alive, to anoint another king. And he sends Samuel to a place that we've heard about already in the book of Ruth. He sends him to Bethlehem. And in verse 1 there, it says, I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons. So he's this descendant of Ruth, right? And he's got 7 sons. And Samuel says, okay, Jesse, bring me all your sons. And Samuel goes down the line, and he thinks, oh, this first one who's really tall, Eliab, he's the firstborn son. Samuel says, surely this guy's the king. This guy looks kind of like Saul. He's big and strong. And God tells Samuel something that is a principle all through the Bible. He says, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. And then all the sons pass by, and God doesn't lead Samuel to anoint any of them as king. And Samuel says, do you have any other sons? And Jesse says, yeah, David's out in the field with the sheep. He's my youngest son. He's not much. And so David comes in, and God says, this is the man. This is a man after my own heart. Samuel anoints him as king. And so he's not king yet, though, but he's been set apart by God to be the king. And he goes back to the sheepfolds, though, and keeps taking care of Jesse's sheep. First Samuel 17, David kind of makes his big appearance by killing Goliath. He shows up, and his brothers are all soldiers. David's just a shepherd. And there's this giant Goliath who's from the Philistines who's challenging Israel and saying, just send out one man, we'll fight one-on-one, and whoever wins, that nation will take over the other nation, and they will become their slaves, and nobody will step up. Saul won't step up. He's in his tent, and everybody's afraid of Goliath, this giant. And David comes and says, I'll fight him. This guy is speaking and talking down the God of Israel. God help me to fight, to protect the sheep from lions and bears, and he'll help me fight Goliath today. And so God, the point of 1 Samuel 17 is not that David was this amazing slingshot artist who was able to kill Goliath with one stone, and David was super powerful. The point is David was this little shepherd boy. He wasn't anything. He didn't have armor. He didn't have power. But he had faith in God. And God is the hero who delivered this fearful nation of Israel once again. Israel couldn't protect themselves. They couldn't save themselves. They were afraid. Israel's leader, Saul, was afraid and cowering, but God took care of his people. And this is a message we see throughout the Bible. The message is not, hey, you can fight your giants if you're just strong enough and courageous enough. The message is, God will fight your battles for you. You need to trust in him. And that's what David did. He trusted in God. Well, David, after he kills Goliath, that's a pretty good way to kind of come on the scene, and he becomes a leader in Saul's armies and a great military leader, and he rises in fame, and everybody sees David as this great leader, and Saul gets jealous and tries to kill David, and so David flees from Saul in chapters 19 through 30 of 1 Samuel. He's on the run, he's living in caves, and he's on his own, he's isolated, and Saul's trying to kill him, and David is trying to trust in God. And he has 2 opportunities to kill Saul, and he doesn't do it. He said, no, this is the king still, and I'm going to respect him, and I'm not going to try to force my way in. I'm going to trust in God. Eventually, Saul dies, and in 2 Samuel, David becomes the king. And so Saul, remember, was from the line of Benjamin, from the tribe of Benjamin, and David is from the line of Judah. So God completely rejects the descendants of Saul as the future kings, and he takes David and he says, "Okay, David, from the line of Judah, you're going to be, you and your descendants will be king over Israel." And in 2 Samuel 7, God's given peace to David on all sides. There's no more war going on, and David's living in his palace, and he says, man, God is dwelling with the people in a tent, this tabernacle. I want to build him a great temple. It's greater than my palace. And God comes to him and says, in verse 4, would you build me a house to dwell in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up my people of Israel from Egypt to this day. But I have been moving about in a tent for my dwelling. He says, you don't need to build me a house, David. And in fact, here's what I'm going to do. He comes to him and he says to David in verse 11 of 2 Samuel 7, I'm going to build you a house. And from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel, and I will give you, hold on just a second. Here we go, at the end of verse 11. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. And so he says, I'm going to do something for you, David. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. But look at the way he's going to establish it. Verse 16, and your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever, in accordance with all these words, in accordance with all this vision. So this is what's called, 2 Samuel 7 is what's called the Davidic covenant. So we have the Abrahamic covenant, where God came to Abraham and said, I'm going to bless you and make your name great. I'm going to give you a land. I'm going to bless all the nations through you. You have the Mosaic covenant, where God says, Israel, you're my people, I'm your God, and things will go well for you when you obey me and worship me, and things will go badly for you when you don't. Now we have the Davidic covenant. God comes to a descendant of Abraham, right, and a descendant of Judah, from the line of Judah, and he says to David, you're the king now, and in the future your descendants, or one of your descendants, is going to reign forever and ever and ever on the throne, and his kingdom will have no end. So there's this promise to David, and it's an exciting promise, and David's amazed by it. And it's unclear at this time how that's going to be fulfilled. It could be fulfilled in a couple ways. One is just if you have righteous king after righteous king after righteous king, and they just keep having sons, and David's descendants reign forever. Or if there was one king who somehow was righteous and who could somehow live forever. Those are kind of the two potential ways you can imagine this promise, this covenant being fulfilled. The other thing to notice is that God says, I'm going to do this. I'm going to take care of it. All right, it's not as contingent on as the Mosaic covenant was. Well, things go well all the way up through chapter 10, but then you come to 2 Samuel 11, and in chapters 11 through 24, you have David's sins and their consequences. Okay, so in chapter 11, David is sent everybody off to battle and war, and he's up in his palace, and he sees this woman Bathsheba that he finds attractive, and he commits adultery with her. And it's really even worse than adultery, because he's the king, and he calls for her to be brought to his palace, and so she really didn't seem to have much choice, but it's not presented as a rape. And in fact, she was bathing out in the open outside the palace, maybe trying to attract his attention, but the Bible doesn't tell us all of that. What we do know is that she gets pregnant, and her husband's off at war for several months, and so it'll be obvious that the baby is not from him. And so David calls her husband Uriah back from the battle to know how the battle's going, but he won't go and stay with his wife. He says, well, all my men are at battle, I'm not going to go sleep with my wife. Well, that's going on, and so David tries to get him drunk, and he still won't go home. He sleeps in the courtyard with the other servants. And so David arranges to have him killed so that he won't be found out for taking his wife and sleeping with her. And then after he's killed, David takes Bathsheba into his palace and makes her one of his wives. And this is another way David sinned, by multiplying and marrying multiple women. And so David has Bathsheba. Their first son dies. They have another son named Solomon. But he has other wives, and there's multiple children. And the story of what happens in 2 Samuel is, again, you have this leader. It seems promising. It seems like David's great. He's going to help Israel. He's going to lead Israel to righteousness. But David fails, just like all the others failed. Moses couldn't go into the promised land. The judges were sinful, and David's sinful too. And one of the main ways he sins is he doesn't listen to God, who says, don't take on many wives as a king. And he has many wives, and they have children. And it's like just a mess in this giant mixed family. There's all kinds of, serious mess. And so in chapter 13, Amnon, one of his sons from one of his wives, is attracted to Tamar and rapes her. And then Tamar's, so that's his half-sister, Tamar's brother, Absalom, takes vengeance on Amnon and kills him. And so then Absalom flees after he kills him. Absalom comes back, and David's happy he's back, but David doesn't really deal with things, and Absalom ends up leading a coup, trying to take the throne from his father, and David flees for a while, and Absalom's killed. So like I said, it's just a big mess going on in the nation. Towards the end of the book, David sins again, and trying to find the right chapter here. Yeah, so David sins again by taking a census, counting all of the soldiers that he has under his command. And this is a sin basically because he's not trusting God. He's trusting in his own strength. And God sends judgment on David's sin, and David builds an altar. He goes out and he buys a piece of land, and David builds an altar to sacrifice and acknowledge his sin before God. And God responds to the plea and relents of the disaster that he said he was going to bring on Israel because of David's sin. So that's the basic of the story of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Things to keep in mind is you have David, the descendant of Ruth, who is this king, and God makes this great promise to David the king that one of his descendants is going to reign forever over the people and on the throne, and God will establish his kingdom forever, but David's a sinner. And so the fulfillment of God's promises have not arrived when we come to the end of 2nd Samuel. Next, we have the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings. So beginning of 1st Kings, you have David dying. And his son Solomon, who was the second son that was born to him and Bathsheba, Solomon's born. And Solomon becomes the king over Israel. And again, a lesson there is, there's this deep sin that David committed with Bathsheba, killing Uriah. And God sent Nathan the prophet to confront David and with his sin, and David repented. He was brokenhearted, acknowledged his sin, and wrote Psalm 51 during that period of time, in which he said, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me." And David, it's just this great psalm of repentance and confession. And David asks of God, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." some people have a hard time with David because of how badly he sinned. They say, well, David shouldn't be seen as anything. But one of the ways David's an example to us is he's a sinner who acknowledged his sin and sought mercy from God. And God had mercy on him, and God changed him. And the only way to have a relationship with God, if you're a human being, is to be a sinner who asks God for mercy and forgiveness. And God is quick to forgive those who humble themselves before him. But we come to 1 Kings, and David has died. Solomon, who is the son of David and Bathsheba, becomes the king, and things start off really promising. So in 1 Kings 2 through chapter 11, you have the reign of Solomon, which starts off promising. Solomon, right off the bat, he becomes the king, and God comes to him in the night and says, Solomon, you can have anything you want. You can ask me for anything you want. It's almost like a genie situation, like from Aladdin. It's not at all, but it's, well, I just said it's almost like, and then I said it's not at all. So what am I, which am I saying? God says, Solomon, ask me for anything you want. What's on your heart? And Solomon says, give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to govern this, your great people? Solomon asks for wisdom. All right? He says, here's the one thing I want, God. I want wisdom in order to be a good ruler over these people. And as you work your way through 1 Kings, you see God blessing him with great wisdom. And Solomon builds the temple of God, which is one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world, this magnificent building with all kinds of gold and all kinds of silver, and just, it's huge, and it's a fitting kind of earthly dwelling place for the presence of God with his people. And there's peace. Solomon's not having to fight anybody. There's peace on all sides. In fact, when you come to chapter 10 of 1 Kings, and the Queen of Sheba, who comes up from the south, and she just hears about Solomon's great wisdom and all of his wealth, and the way that all the people in his kingdom are blessed, and she comes to listen to him and ask questions, and she ends up being amazed by Solomon's wisdom. And look at verse 9 here. Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and set you on the throne of Israel. Because the Lord loved Israel forever, he has made you king, that you may execute justice and righteousness. And then she gives Solomon a bunch of gold. All right, so here's another example. God blessing a descendant of Abraham, blessing the nation of Israel, and the other nations around being drawn to God because of the way God was blessing Solomon and the nations. And so you see this going on, and you think, if you're just reading through the story, you think, well, okay, maybe God's promise to David is coming true in Solomon, this king who's going to set up this great kingdom that's going to go on forever, and all the blessings, all the promises are going to come true, and God's people are going to dwell in God's place with God, under God's ruler forever, and it's going to be great. And you could think that if you get into 1 Kings 10, but then once you get to 1 Kings 11, you see Solomon turn from the Lord. And in verse 2, it said that God had told the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with other nations, neither shall they with you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. And so God had this law. He said, don't do this. And it wasn't a matter of racial purity at all. We saw Ruth, who was a Moabite woman, come and say, okay, God is my God. And she was blessed. She's a hero of the Bible. The Old Testament is not teaching in any way a kind of ethnic purity or anything like this. The reason God said don't marry outside of your nation was because he knew that if they married with these other nations, Israel would take on the customs and the religion and the idolatry of the other nations. Well, Solomon, he goes all out in disobeying God. He has 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines. So, pretty quickly into his rule, he just sins horribly. Now, many of these marriages are kind of political alliances, which is something you see throughout world history. Marrying in order to create peace between kingdoms, but also Solomon, you could look in Ecclesiastes, one of the things he just goes after pleasure with everything he has. And for these different reasons, he disobeys God. And exactly what God said would happen happens. Solomon turns away from the Lord, the God of Israel, and he does go after other gods. We see that in verse 9 and 10. So God says to him in verse 11, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and will give it to your servant. Yet for the sake of David your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. And so Solomon rules over the nation of Israel, but then as soon as he dies, you see there, the reign of Solomon goes up to chapter 11, but then as soon as he dies, in chapter 12, his son Rehoboam becomes the king. All right, so Rehoboam becomes the king, and Rehoboam basically is foolish, and he's really hard on the people, and they revolt. And Jeroboam, another one of Solomon's sons, says, I'll be the king. Right? And so 11 of the tribes of Israel go and follow Jeroboam. All the northern tribes. And that becomes, this is important, this is probably something that if you grew up in a church like I grew up, you may not have picked this up. So you have a united kingdom under Saul, David, and Solomon. Solomon dies, and the 11 of the tribes go and follow Jeroboam, and that becomes what's called the northern kingdom, and after this point they're called Israel. Only the tribe of Judah follows Rehoboam. Only the tribe of Judah follows the first son of Solomon, and that becomes called the tribe of Judah and the nation of Judah. So you have the northern kingdom, Israel, and the southern kingdom, Judah. All descendants of Abraham, but from different tribes, and it's a divided kingdom. And sometimes they partner together, but sometimes they fight against each other, and they end up with different trajectories, different futures. When I say Israel, I'm talking about the northern kingdom, all right, which usually had really almost all unfaithful kings. And in verse 6 here, we see Assyria come capture Samaria, which is kind of in the north, and that's where the Israelite kingdom is, the northern kingdom. And Assyria carries the Israelites away to Assyria and places them in Halah and Habor and the river of Gozan and the cities of the Medes. So the Assyrians come and they conquer the northern kingdom, and they take a lot of their people and they spread them out. And one of the ways Assyria held power was trying to get all the different nations they conquered to intermix, so there's not kind of a loyalty to your people anymore. And here's why it happened, God says in verse 7. This occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh king of Egypt, and had feared other gods and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced. So the kings of Israel were sinful, and they led the people into idolatry, and God brings judgment through the nation of Assyria, which conquers the northern kingdom. 2 Kings 18 through 25 is the remaining history of Judah, which remember is that one tribe in the south which stayed under kind of the Davidic line of kings. But they, again, many of those kings are unfaithful, and they depart from the Lord and worship other gods. And 1st and 2nd Kings tells the story of both of these kingdoms and their kings and how they lead the nation astray. But in 586 BC, all right, 586 BC, Babylon comes and conquers Judah, all right, and takes Judah into captivity. And Nebuchadnezzar is the king when this happens. And so later on we'll talk about books like Daniel and tell the story of being taken from the land and taken by Nebuchadnezzar into Babylon. And now God's people, which are so connected to the land, are having to learn to live in exile. All right? And so that is 1st and 2nd Kings. Now we come to 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and you come to 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and you're going to think, wait, haven't I already read this? It's not exactly the same, but a lot of the same material is covered. A lot of the same people are covered. And so in 1st Chronicles 1 through 9, you have the genealogies, the connection of the nation to Abraham and all the promises of God. But then between 1st Chronicles 10 and 2nd Chronicles 9, you have the telling of the united monarchy. So most of these books, or much of the books, are spent on David and Solomon, telling about how God raised them up and blessed them, and how in what ways they were faithful, and how the temple was built. And there's all this emphasis on the temple. And then the post-schism kingdom, 2nd Chronicles 10 through 36, it traces the northern and southern kingdoms and their kings and their lack of faithfulness, and those who were faithful, and then the destruction of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile in 2nd Chronicles 36. So basically, you have a lot of the same information. So what's going on? Why is the book of Chronicles in our Bible? There is new information, but that's not the main reason it was there. Here's why the book of Chronicles was written. Think about it. You're an Israelite, and you have read the law plenty, and you know the promises of God, and you're dwelling in the land, and you have the temple, and you have God dwelling in your presence, and you're experiencing the promises of God. And you have read and heard about the Davidic covenant, how God promised to David that his throne would last forever. And so an heir of David is your king. And so you're in Judah, and you feel blessed, and you feel close to God, and you believe these promises. But then your leaders have sinned over the years and been unfaithful. And now these Babylonians, these evil people who hate God and who are wicked, have come and they've conquered you. And the conquering of Judah was devastating to the people of God. And they're in a foreign land, and they're having to learn how can they worship God. The temple's been destroyed. An heir of David is no longer reigning on the throne, which calls them to question the promises of God. So in 586 BC, this happens, and they go into captivity. But God sends prophets, and many of the people pray, and God has not forgotten his promises. Persia, the Persian kingdom, now comes and conquers Babylon, the Babylonian kingdom, and Persia has a different policy about the nations they conquer. Rather than trying to take everybody out of the land and distribute them, they have kind of this benevolent dictator approach, and they say, we want you to worship your own gods and live in your own land as long as you pay taxes and tributes to us and live in peace. And so in 538 BC, about 50 years later, there's a king in Persia named Cyrus, and he allows Judah to return to their land and to begin to rebuild the temple. Okay? And so the people make this kind of second exodus. They've been rejected, and they've left the promised land, kind of like Jacob and his 12 sons did going into Egypt. Now they've left, they've gone to Babylon, and now they're returning into the promised land. And they're rebuilding the temple, and they're reestablishing the nation. And 1st and 2nd Chronicles, here's the point. 1st and 2nd Chronicles was written at that time. It was written at the time when the people were coming back into the land, rebuilding the temple. And it was written, it's a retelling of the history of the people of Israel to give hope. To remind them of the promises of God, to remind them of the way God blessed David and Solomon, to remind them of the way the first temple was built, and to not just give them hope, but also to give them instruction. 1st and 2nd Chronicles, here's the theme. It records the history of the people of Israel before the exile into Babylon. And it records how when they sought the Lord, how there was great blessing, and when they forsake the Lord or forsook the Lord, how things went badly for them. And First and Second Chronicles is written to call the people to believe the promises of God and stay faithful to Him. And to be faithful means to obey God and His law, but also to participate fully in the worship of the temple that's now being rebuilt by Cyrus, or under Cyrus's command. To forsake God means to disobey Him and to go out after idols. And as you read through 1st and 2nd Chronicles, you see the result of idolatry. And 2nd Chronicles ends with the destruction of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile. And this book is a history, but it's a history to teach, to say, look what happened when people were faithful. David was blessed. Solomon was blessed. We had the temple. And when the kings were not faithful, Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed, and people were taken into exile. Now God's brought us back into the land. Cyrus has decreed to let us come back into the land, and now there's hope. Okay? We're restarting. The very end of the book of 2nd Chronicles 36 ends with Cyrus's decree to go back in. And they're restarting, and the chronicler is kind of saying, let's be faithful this time. But he's recognized that Israel's tendency to sin, and that they're really, over and over again, have proven themselves unable to obey God fully. And so one of the main themes of Chronicles is the need for forgiveness. And that's where the emphasis on the temple is. Saying, go to the temple. Be faithful to the sacrificial system that God has given us and instructed us to participate in, because all of these sacrifices in the temple remind us and show us that we're sinners and we need God's grace. We need Him to forgive us. And so one of the most famous passages in this book is found in 2nd Chronicles 7:12, and it's about what Solomon said at the dedication of the temple. But keep in mind when this book was written, and you'll think about how this is instructive to the people. So it says, the Lord appeared to Solomon in the night and said to him, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. And God says, when I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or command the locusts to devour the land, or send pestilence among the people, if my people who are called by my name, so he's saying, if the people sin and I bring judgment, here's what to do. If my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land. Now my eyes will be open and my ears attentive to the prayer that is made in this place, that's at the temple. For now I have chosen and consecrated this house that my name may be there forever. My eyes and my heart will be there for all time. And so God's telling them, and this book of Chronicles is telling them, if you sin, go back to God. Make sacrifices, repent, call out to Him, pray, go to the temple, trust in God. You need God's mercy, and we need to be faithful to God. And so that's what 1st and 2nd Chronicles is all about. Now, the book after 2nd Chronicles is Ezra. And I put Ezra and Nehemiah because these are really kind of one unit. And we don't know the author of Ezra or Nehemiah, but it's likely that it was the same author, and it's possible that the author of Ezra and Nehemiah is the same author as the book of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. There's a lot of similarities. Now, parts of Ezra clearly come from Ezra's own recollections, and parts of Nehemiah seem to have been reported directly by Nehemiah or recorded by Nehemiah. But it appears the author of these full books isn't either Ezra nor Nehemiah. It's kind of an anonymous, unknown author. But Ezra and Nehemiah continues the history that ends in continues the history of 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So 2nd Chronicles ends with the decree from Cyrus, and what does Ezra start with? Well, it starts with Cyrus's decree to build the house of God. So look at Ezra chapter 1, and you see, in the 1st year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. So the Bible's telling us that this Cyrus, this king who didn't believe in God, was being led by God. And the Bible tells us that the hearts of kings are directed by God. That even when it appears someone is against God, that God has not lost control, and that he can lead the decisions of our rulers. And that's one of the reasons in the book of 1 Timothy we're told to pray for the rulers of our nation and other nations, that God would accomplish his purposes. But here's what Cyrus, king of Persia, said. He says, "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. And let him go to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem." So you see, he doesn't fully get that this is the God of who's not just in Jerusalem. "And let each survivor in whatever place he sojourns be assisted by the men of his place with silver and gold, with goods and with beasts, besides freewill offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem." So Cyrus says, go rebuild the temple. And the book of Ezra is telling the story of the leaders of the house of Judah and Benjamin, priests and Levites, all these people going back to Judah and to Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple. All right, so Ezra chapter 1, verse 5 through Nehemiah 7:72 is telling about the building of the second temple. And in Ezra 1, 5 through 6, the people prepare to go to the land. 1, 7 through 6:22, the community returns and rebuilds the altar and temple in the midst of opposition. So there's much opposition, but God is caring for his people. He's helping them get through all of the conflict, and the temple gets rebuilt. And so it's kind of like I said earlier, it's like a second Exodus. They're in captivity, but God delivers them, and now they've rebuilt the temple, and God is their God, and they're dwelling in the land. Then Ezra and the people of God returned to the land to build a community in the midst of conflict surrounding intermarriage. Chapter 7, 1 through 10:44. The end of the book of Ezra is about people start intermarrying again, marrying with people from other nations and with other gods, and Ezra hears about it and goes, whoa, wait a minute, this is exactly the mess that got us into this in the first place. How, right after we come back, have we forgotten the covenant of God, forgotten the law of God, and are already walking into idolatry? And the last few chapters, it shows them they're not just trying to rebuild the temple, they're trying to rebuild the community, and they want it to stay faithful to God. Nehemiah, that book is about Nehemiah returning to the land in order to rebuild the city wall. And again, there's opposition. So Nehemiah is kind of a servant of the king, and the king sends Nehemiah and gives supplies for Nehemiah, who's kind of like a governor of Jerusalem, to rebuild the city wall. And Jerusalem, the city of God, is being rebuilt. And so once again, like back in Solomon, and hopefully you're keeping up well in the Vaughn Roberts book, God's Big Picture, and that book is really designed to help you understand all this as well. With Solomon, you had God's people dwelling in God's place, dwelling with God in God's place, and with God's king, Solomon, as their ruler. But they lost all that, and they were out of God's place, and now they're back in God's place in Jerusalem, and God is dwelling with them at the temple, and it seems like everything's coming back together. It seems like God's fulfilling his promises. He's brought his people back. And the last few chapters of Nehemiah is the people trying to celebrate the completion of the house of God. It seems like maybe this is the culmination of all of God's promises to Abraham, and we have kind of arrived. But again, what we saw at the end of Ezra is even in all of this celebration and God answering prayers, the people are still sinning. And so something is still wrong. A greater deliverer is still needed, and all of it's pointing forward to a greater temple, a greater Savior, a greater King, who we will see come in the future. Last book we'll talk about is the book of Esther. Now, Esther takes place at the time of the exile. And so, and I didn't mention this in these outlines, but you have exilic and post-exilic Israel, and like 1 Kings, 2 Kings are pre-exilic Israel. Exilic means exiled Israel. And so Ezra and Nehemiah are exilic and post-exilic. Esther is during the exile. Just a second. Okay. So Esther is there in the kingdom, and King Xerxes wants to have a new wife, basically, right? And he doesn't like Vashti, his wife, and so he deposes her, says she's no longer my wife, and they have this big kind of strange competition to see who will become the new wife of Xerxes. So Xerxes is reigning in Persia, and this is at a time when many of the Israelites, or many of the people of Judah, have gone back to Jerusalem and to Judah, what we saw in Ezra and Nehemiah, but not all. Many are still in exile, including Esther and Mordecai. And King Xerxes, or that's his Greek name, his Hebrew name was Ahasuerus. King Xerxes the first, like I said, wants another queen, and so he says, "Okay, get all the beautiful women, and prepare them, and then I'll see which one I want." So clearly not a very desirable king, and definitely not a godly king. And Esther is an Israelite. Esther is, daughter of Abraham, and her parents have died, so she's an orphan. And her cousin Mordecai is kind of her guardian. All right, so that's the basics of the plot, and she becomes the queen. Xerxes likes her the most, and so she becomes the queen, but being the queen is not a super powerful position. It's a little bit of a figurehead. He has all the power, and she can only go into his presence when he wants her to go into his presence, and so it's a hard spot still, for sure. It's not like a Princess Diana situation. Well, Mordecai is her cousin, and he's out in the courtyard near the palace often, and one of Xerxes' servants, Haman, hates Mordecai because Mordecai won't bow down to him, and I'll follow this a little bit. And Mordecai is faithful to God, so he won't bow down to Haman. And so Haman hates Mordecai and wants to hurt him, but doesn't just want him to get killed. He wants all of his people to be killed. Remember, Persia has conquered all kinds of people groups. And so Haman decides that he'll get his king to sign a decree that says we're going to commit genocide and kill all of the Jews. And this will really bring pain to Mordecai. And Mordecai sends word up to Esther, who's kind of separated from a lot of the events going on in the kingdom as the queen. Mordecai sends word up to Esther and says, hey, all your people are about to be wiped out. And Esther said, what can I do? If I go into the king's presence without him calling me to come in, he'll kill me. And Mordecai says to Esther this famous passage in verse 14, if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. And so Mordecai says, well, maybe the reason you're the queen is for this exact time. And one of the interesting things about Esther is that the name of God is not mentioned in the whole book of Esther. But it's clear that God is at work providentially through all of these circumstances. And Esther says, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. It doesn't say prayer, but that's implied. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. It's just a great example of faithful courage. God doesn't tell us how everything's going to work out. We don't know why we're in the situations we're in a lot of times. But Mordecai says, maybe you're here because God's put you here. And Esther says, yeah, maybe that's true, and I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm going to do the right thing, and if I perish, I perish. It's up to God to work out the details. And so Esther goes in and talks, she presents herself to the king, and the king must have been in a good mood, and says, okay, Esther, come and talk to me. And in fact, he says, okay, whatever you want, I'll do for you. And Esther says, okay, I want a banquet, you and Haman, this man who's plotting to kill all the Jews. And Haman is really excited, and they go to this feast, and then Esther kind of extends it and says, okay, here's my request. I want you guys to come to another feast tomorrow night. It's going to be a huge feast. And so they say, okay, and Haman's just so thrilled that he's being honored by the queen, and he's the only guy who got invited to the feast, but he goes out, and he's just so happy, but then he sees Mordecai again, and Mordecai won't bow down to him. And Haman's filled with envy and rage, and he just hates that this guy won't submit and bow down to him like he wants. And so he goes out and he has this huge gallows built. And he's so excited to hang Mordecai and kill him and get rid of him. And he stays up all night getting these gallows built. And that same night, the king it just so happens that he can't go to sleep that night. And so he has the book of the records brought into his presence, and he just has his servant read from these records of the history of Persia. And one of the things that happened early on in the book is that Mordecai, Esther's cousin, had uncovered a plot to kill the king, and had told people about it, and the plot had been thwarted, and so the king's life was preserved. And so the king says, well, what was done for this man? And nothing was ever done to honor Mordecai. And so the king thinks, okay, I need to remedy that. So the next day they have this second banquet, the second giant feast there in chapter 7. Esther comes in, and actually before that, Mordecai comes in. And yeah, before the feast, Mordecai comes in, Haman comes in, and the king says, Haman, you're my advisor. What would you do for somebody what should be done for somebody the king wants to greatly honor? And Haman, full of pride, thinks, oh, he's talking about me. And so he tells the king this great way to honor a man, to put him on the king's horse and give the king's seal to him, and have him walk through the streets and decree to everybody that you should honor this man. And the king says to Haman, okay, go and you do this for Mordecai. And of course, Haman is just appalled and disgusted, and he has to go out and get the horse, and he has to put Mordecai on and have him honored, and he's disgusted. But he goes to the banquet, and his life goes from bad to much, much worse as Esther goes and says, okay, now king, here's my one request. And the king says, what's your request? And she says, I'm a part of the people of the Jews, and they're all going to be killed because of this decree, and I'd like it stopped. And the king says, who could have thought of such a horrible idea to wipe out your people? And she says, it's this man, the other guy invited to the feast, Haman. And Haman's terrified, and so he goes and he pleads with Esther for mercy. The king comes back into the room and thinks that he's assaulting his wife, his queen. And so Haman, ironically, is hanged on the gallows that he had made to hang Mordecai. And it's just, the book of Esther is just filled with all of this irony and reversal. And instead of the Jews being killed, the king sends out an edict, a decree through all the land that they should be honored. And if anybody tries to hurt them, that they should take up arms and harm the people who try to hurt the people of the Jews. And then there's this feast, Purim, which is instituted to celebrate this event where God delivered his people in exile through Esther and Mordecai. So again, what we see in the book of Esther is God's providential care for his people even when they're in exile. Even when it seems things couldn't go any more wrong, where this Jewish girl is made to be kind of the forced wife of the king, God is still at work. And even when it seems they're about to be wiped out, God is preserving his people even in exile. He's not going to forget his promises that he has made to Abraham, and that he's made to Isaac and Jacob and David, and God will keep all of his promises. So as the historical books, you'll need to have listened to this, and after you've listened to this, studied these PowerPoint slides, read the passages, you'll be ready to take the quiz in week 3. Please email me if you have any questions, especially any questions about these texts. We covered a huge amount of territory really quickly, just an hour and a half, all of these major books with all of this history. And so there's a good chance there are pieces or parts that I haven't explained as well as they could be explained. So if something doesn't make sense or you have questions, please send me an email. And if you'd like to set up an appointment to talk by phone or FaceTime or Skype, I'd be happy to do that. So just shoot me an email. All right, have a good week.